Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. Well, it's been nearly a decade in the making, but finally the Arms Trade Treaty was approved by an overwhelming majority at the United Nations. The vote went to the General Assembly after North Korea, Iran and Syria had earlier blocked an adoption of a draft treaty. Those three countries were the only ones to vote against the treaty, which will now provide the first regulation of $70 billion annual trade in arms. It will regulate the business of small arms and light weapons, tanks, armoured vehicles, military jets and missiles. Individual nations will now be asked to ratify the treaty, which would incorporate its terms into each country's domestic law. Once 50 countries have ratified it, the treaty becomes international law. Human rights groups have hailed the move as a step towards halting the proliferation of violent conflict and human rights abuses. But will it? Does something drafted in New York have the potential to stop weapons getting into the hands of iniquitous regimes around the world? Critics say that it has no teeth and that the biggest arms suppliers, which are the permanent members of the UN, will use it to suit their own interests. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Kay Stearman from the Campaign Against Arms Trade. Also in the studio is Carly Florentine. She's a freelance journalist who's written about this issue. On the line, we have Martin Butcher, a policy advisor for Oxfam. And also on the line is Charlie Wolfe, an American writer and broadcaster. A warm welcome to you all. First of all, I spoke to Brian Wood, who's the Amnesty International's manager of arms control, a little bit earlier on. And this is what he told me in reaction to the treaty.
It's not a panacea to solve all problems to do with the misuse of conventional arms and illicit trafficking. But it will be a major step. It's an absolutely historic landmark to get this treaty, because up until now, conventional arms have been one of the few commodities traded that don't have an international legally binding regulatory system.
Kay Stearman, a truly historic treaty, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly historic, but will it make a historic impact? I think that's what we've got to ask. And unfortunately, Campaign Against Arms Trade thinks it will have very little effect on world trade in arms. In fact, our fear is that it's actually going to legitimise the arms trade even further and entrench it even further.
But it is a legitimate trade, isn't it? It's traded $70 billion a trade each year. It's not going to go away. This is at least a step in the right direction.
Well, we're talking about legal rather than legitimate. Things that are legal are not necessarily regarded as legitimate. And I can certainly say that here in the UK, many people regard the arms trade as either completely immoral or used in a way which is certainly not ethical. For example, we sell arms to countries that are highly authoritarian, undemocratic, which use arms to abuse their own people or to act aggressively towards their neighbours. We sell arms sometimes to countries that really shouldn't be spending that money on arms, but should be spending it on health and welfare and education and so on. So I would say many people certainly don't regard the arms trade as legitimate or responsible or ethical. And our fear is that the Arms Trade Treaty is giving a label to this sort of label to all sorts of arms trading relations, which certainly should not be regarded like that.
Carly Florentine, I mean, what do you make of it? Do you think this legitimises an illegitimate kind of trade?
I think that's an interesting point. Obviously, I'm gladdened by the fact that it has now been regulated, but having an arms trade in general is quite hard in itself to legitimise, I believe. But in terms of changing the way things are done, I do think it's a very important achievement for the UN, but I do think, there's a lot of work that now has to be done.
Charlie Wolfe, it's an important achievement for the United Nations, isn't it?
No, I don't think so, because let me agree with Kate to an extent. It's pretty toothless. Implementation is years away. There's no enforcement mechanism. And I guess from an American perspective, it doesn't stop there. This is sort of the beginning, and NGOs will demand more, so I don't know where this thing will go in years. I can also add, just from an American perspective, obviously, even though President Obama has signed this, it has to be ratified by the Senate before it comes law, and the Senate is not going to approve this because it doesn't gel with our own U.S. Constitution with the Second Amendment. By
that, you're referring to the pressure from gun lobbyists in the United States, I presume.
Not just gun lobbyists. There are people. I'm not in the gun lobby. I don't own weapons, but I value the Second Amendment. So I think this runs counter to that. So we would see major problems with that. There's bipartisan rejection of this in the Senate. Both parties do not want to see this signed, and as long as it's on the table, I don't see it being signed, or I should say, I don't see it being ratified, at least by the current Senate, and probably not for the distant future.
But it was politically expedient for Barack Obama to make a point of this treaty after he was re-elected, wasn't it? Wouldn't it look a bit odd if the United States, if the Senate rejected it now? I mean, the United States, as the world's biggest arms supplier, needs to be behind this, doesn't it?
Not at all. The Senate's job, of course, has a constitutional role of a check and a balance on the President, and it has to protect the Constitution, and the Constitution very plainly states that the Second Amendment gives the right to bear arms, and we feel that this treaty would impinge on that. So they're not going to, just as, for instance, the climate change treaty that was signed by the Clinton administration was never ratified, and then finally George Bush took it off the table. And a future president, again, has that ability to take the signature off that treaty if it's not ratified.
But, Charlie Wolf, I mean, the treaty does have wording that bears the hallmarks of the NRA, but it says that each country has the right to regulate and control conventional arms within its own territory, so that would presumably satisfy the NRA, wouldn't it?
No, I don't think so. Again, I see where this treaty can be amended and changed. NGOs, such as the people you have on today, are going to be demanding more. And also, I think just overall as a treaty, I see problems with it. Eventually I see a supranational national review body, and I don't think that the United States in its foreign policy should be answering to some sort of plebiscite, some sort of supernatural review body on who we trade arms with. For instance, would we be sued by the Palestinians over giving the Israelis arms to defend themselves with?
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the Arms Trade Treaty agreed at the United Nations. With me in the studio is Kay Stearman, a spokesperson for the Campaign Against Arms Trade, Carly Florentine, a freelance journalist who writes on this topic, Charlie Wolf, American writer and broadcaster, and Martin Butcher, policy advisor for Oxfam. I'll turn to Martin Butcher, policy advisor for Oxfam. This is a significant problem, isn't it? I mean, a lot of warm words came out after 154 countries approved of this. But if the United States, if it doesn't get through Senate, the world's biggest arms supplier, can't come on board, then it's all been for naught, hasn't it?
Well, no, that's not the case. I mean, this is a historic achievement, as Brian Wood said in that interview you did. The nations of the world have agreed to put international humanitarian law and human rights law at the center of regulating the global trade in arms. The way the treaty will work is that each country will use the terms of the treaty as a framework to put into national law, and then national governments will do the implementation work. They will then come together on a regular basis in conferences of states parties to make sure that they are doing the work as they should be doing. Obviously, we hope very much that the United States Senate will look beyond the red herring of the Second Amendment. This has nothing to do with the Second Amendment. It's purely about the trade in arms across international borders. And we'll ratify the treaty, but we understand that will be very hard and is likely to come far in the future. However, the United States already has regulations and laws governing arms exports, and those will continue to apply. So the vast majority of what's in the treaty will already be done by the US government, even if it never ratifies.
Charlie Wolf, it's got nothing to do with the Second Amendment, and it won't actually mean a government grab of individual Americans' guns, will it?
No, I don't believe that, and I think, again, the treaty will expand itself, and that is a worry. And also, I have to ask the other panelists who are in favor of this treaty, and I understand their intentions and their desires. Do they really think that, for instance, Iran is no longer going to supply Hezbollah or Hamas? Is Russia no longer going to supply Syria? Is North Korea not going to supply other terrorist groups or other nations? I just don't see how this is going to work. It's a grand statement, but again, I just don't trust, knowing the setup of the General Assembly and the sort of undemocratic structure of it, I just don't see how this is going to work.
Kay Stearman from the Campaign Against Arms Trade. Some of the loudest voices for this treaty actually came from Africa, and in fact Kenya made an impassioned plea. But countries that are particularly beset by violence did want this. That's got to count for something, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly counts for something in the sense that this obviously was a grassroots movement. It was backed by millions of people around the world. Some of the most voices most in favour came from countries which had been beset by violence. And as you say, that's got to count for something. The trouble is, I don't think this treaty is going to actually do what those people want. I'd just like to return to the point of regulation. As was pointed out, the US does have regulations on the arms it exports. They're quite tough on paper. The same thing for Britain and for EU countries. They do regulate arms exports in the sense that they go before the Department of Business. There's a special arms control unit there that looks at them. The trouble is, there's around 10,000 export license applications each year, and only a tiny handful ever get refused. Hardly any are ever revoked. We, in Britain, for example, approve arms exports to countries in the Middle East who use those same arms to mow down their own people. By any common sense criteria of human rights abuse, we approve, and the US approves, arms that go to human rights abusers. So I'm not sure what an arms trade treaty would actually add to that. If the major arms exporters don't take their own regulations seriously, what hope do we have of the treaty, the countries signing the treaty taking arms export regulations seriously?
Further to that, Carly Florentine, Europe already has rules in place on the export of arms. No one seems to pay any attention to that. Is it likely that a treaty like this would stop arms from going from Iran to Syria, say, or Britain to Bahrain or Saudi Arabia?
I think there is a lot of disagreement whether, when this does come in place, it will change anything that's happening in Syria. But we're thinking more in terms of the future to prevent there being another Syria, for example. I think that the shift in thoughts regarding this will be sort of very slow moving and gradual. But I think things will take place at the level of the paradigm first, which will eventually, influence behaviour. Because at the moment, people do say this is really just a set of principles. However, the arms trade is something without many principles. So, it really is a step to take you on to the next stage.
Martin Butcher from Oxfam. Fundamental to Britain's industrial or economic policy is selling arms overseas, and in fact it is subsidised to the tune of several £100 million a year. It can't really take the moral high ground and regulate the flow of arms when it's spending hundreds of millions of pounds trying to get arms contracts, and it's selling arms to Saudi Arabia and countries like Bahrain.
I think that's absolutely right. And Oxfam and the Campaign Against the Arms Trade have a very similar view of the kinds of sales that are wrong and the kinds of sales the British government should not be making. It's how we go about stopping this that I think is maybe the only difference between us. The treaty will create an international norm, and the power of such norms is quite strong amongst governments. Russia, China, the United States are not on board the treaty that bans landmines, but they no longer export or use landmines themselves. So they have been brought into that norm of behaviour without signing a piece of paper. This is something that will take a lot of time to change behaviour. And we're going to get right down and challenge the British government, for example, on arms sales or gifts potentially in the near future to Syrian rebels. The government, which has promoted the arms trade treaty, says that it wants to supply arms to rebels in Syria. We say that will exacerbate the conflict. It will increase human rights abuses. It will cause more problems than it could possibly solve, and they shouldn't be doing it. We will, use their signature on this document when that happens to challenge this kind of policy, and that's something that all of the nations of the world will be coming together to do, or at least all the signatories, all the member states of this treaty in the future will be coming together to do on a regular basis, and that has to be for the good.
Just some of the wording of the final draft treaty. It said it would prohibit states from selling weapons when they have knowledge at the time of authorization that the arms or items would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, and grave breaches of the Geneva Convention. I mean, could Western countries perhaps, and you've raised the case of Syria, perhaps use that as a pretext for anti-genocide measures, meaning liberal interventionism? And that's perhaps something that is of concern.
Yes, I can see that might be of concern, but the kind of knowledge that governments have to have is not specifically of specific incidents that have already happened, or at least not those alone. It's of a risk that these things might happen in the future, and the kinds of information they have to use can be gathered from a very wide variety of sources, including NGOs like the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, like Oxfam, like Amnesty International, and you can be sure that we will be pressing them on this all the way.
But isn't there the sense that under the terms of that treaty, that nations can simply plead ignorance? I mean, what would be the consequences if they flouted those rules set?
No, there isn't a supranational body that will run the arms trade across the world. There is no policeman who can use physical force to change government policy. But as I've said, the governments don't like to be shamed in front of other governments, and the moral power of an international norm is quite strong. We can't judge where the situation is today and say that the treaty would work immediately. It isn't a panacea. It is, however, the beginning of the building of a body of international law which over 10, 20, 30 years will make a real difference in people's lives.
Carly Florentine, I mean, do you see the sense that perhaps, the biggest arms exporters happen to be the permanent members of the United Nations, but this would really only be effective if countries that already had an existing ethical foreign policy, countries that don't have a particularly ethical foreign policy, it won't make any difference to them?
I agree really with what Martin was saying about, even people who aren't going to agree to the treaty or sign up, they will be actually influenced by the norm that, has, being originated now, and a precedent will be set in the future. Of course, that there's a lot of concern over the fact, Russia, for example, and China did abstain from voting, and after the US, they are the largest exporters of arms. The biggest problem at the moment, is this idea of how we're actually going to enforce the treaty. Because at the moment, we need to start now on the campaign for implementation, because I think that really is still a vague area.
Charlie Wolfe, Martin Butcher raised the point there that other countries can be shamed into towing the line, I suppose. I mean, do you think that is likely or probable? At the very least, this does improve transparency in the arms trade, which we haven't had up until this point.
No, I don't think so. It may. I don't know if it'll necessarily shame the United States. We already have, as been mentioned, regulation, and I think that we're a free and open democracy, so there is a chance if people don't like what's going on with their government, they have the right to complain. But I don't see how an editorial in the New York Times or the United Nations is going to shame countries like Iran, or even, with due respects, the Russians. So the people that are the problem are not going to be solved. I mean, let's reference back to the landmines treaty. Well, countries like the United States needed to use landmines, and they used them properly. It's used strictly for moving tanks and what have you, the military purposes. They're going to respect the treaty, or they're already going to have a means in place that's respectful of the treaty. But I don't see other countries that never had any respect for that changing because of the landmines treaty. They're still using them, and using them incorrectly.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the Arms Trade Treaty agreed at the United Nations with Kay Stearman, Charlie Wolfe, Carly Florentine and Martin Butcher. Kay Stearman, I mean, there's not going to be ever going to be a fully restrictive treaty, but at least this increase in transparency certainly is a step in the right direction, isn't it? Even if it's not exactly what your group wants.
Well, transparency in itself is good, of course, because if you've got transparency, it's much easier to hold your government to account, to question them, and possibly to get a change in policy. So we're very keen to see greater transparency. But it's only a first step. You can have all the transparency in the world, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be following a policy where you're regulating or restraining the arms trade. Could I just say something about the landmines situation, because that's a very interesting one. Campaign Against Arms Trade was an early supporter of the banning landmines campaign, and we were very glad to see the convention passed. But the interesting thing there, of course, is that landmines are not an issue for big arms companies. There wasn't actually very many vested interests in favour of landmines. A lot of them were homemade, and many of them were made by fairly small companies. No country had a big vested interest in maintaining an industry around landmines. The point about the Arms Trade Treaty, and in the preamble it very explicitly states that you should be taking commercial and economic interests into account. And so you can see that many big arms companies would see the Arms Trade Treaty as something which would benefit them. And certainly the British government presented it that way. This is a level playing field for arms companies. So there's rather different economic interests.
So you're saying that the economic interests would override any kind of humanitarian aspects to it?
They're taken into account. They've got to be considered. That's a very interesting point.
Martin Butcher from Oxfam, there is this danger, isn't it? I mean, the arms trade, big arms traders will potentially benefit from this.
There is certainly an extent to which arms companies in countries like the UK and the United States have been supportive of this process because they think it'll do what they call leveling the playing field, that the Russians, the Chinese will start to play to a similar set of rules to them, and that will benefit them. But I think that's much less of a worry for us than the positive benefits of the treaty. And if you look, for example, at implementation in, say, certain sub-Saharan African countries, if one of the things that's a big worry there is the diversion of arms and ammunition from government holdings, and those will now have to begin to be much better regulated, much better protected, if the governments are able to persuade arms sellers that diversion is not a problem in their country. That's one of the key terms of the treaty. If diversion is less of a problem in sub-Saharan Africa, if ammunition is flowing less easily, then conflict will reduce, and the human and economic harm from that intersection of the legitimate and illegitimate arms trade will diminish, and that's a good thing.
Well, let's turn to the conflict that's obviously in the headlines at the moment, Martin Butcher, that in Syria. Do you anticipate something like this treaty, which you're broadly welcoming, would have any kind of immediate impact, or is it really something that can be put in place to prevent future conflicts?
It's more for future conflicts. I mean, the treaty has just been agreed. It will be open for signature on June the 3rd. As you said in your introduction, it will take 50 countries to sign and ratify the treaty before it comes into force. So we're looking 2 or 3 years down the line before that could be the case. There's a lot of work to be done in parliaments around the world to get the treaty in place, to get national regulations in place to allow it to be implemented before it can come into force. However, were the treaty in force now, there is an absolute prohibition in the treaty against the supply of arms and ammunition to countries, and also to anybody who is using those arms to kill civilians, to commit a range of war crimes that you described before. So countries that join the treaty would not be able to supply arms into Syria and will not be able to supply arms into future conflicts. One of the jobs we have to do is to persuade countries like Russia and China that it's in their interests to get on board with this, and to make it more comprehensive than it is at the moment.
It's a study by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Carly Florentine, that said that the weapons trade is changing so quickly that a document agreed to in 2013 will be outmoded almost immediately.
I wouldn't say that I would agree with that it would be outmoded so quickly. I think the way that the treaty is actually worded at the moment is more general to allow for full understanding. I mean, of course, all the celebrations and people who have been calling it a victory, some people are saying, well, yes, of course, that's a little bit premature because, we've got to see how this actually works rather than a philosophical level, but a practical level. There's always a chance that we are being over-optimistic and you've got to be a realist as well, of course. But I still do think it's very early days to know the full extent of what this is going to bring about. But I do think it can only be a positive thing, if not so as dramatic or positive as we may like.
Charlie Wolf, I'd like to get your view on the 23 countries that abstained. They included Russia and China, India and Pakistan. I mean, do you think this is significant?
Yes, and again, I just don't see how the treaty is going to work. And I think even those that signed up, I don't know where the French are, but they're usually more motivated by money than anything else. These sort of treaties have never worked. For instance, I'm just looking here about the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was a crowning achievement of the Coolidge administration. This is Max Boot writing at Commentary Magazine. This was the UN banning the use of war to settle international disputes. That one seems to have got past everybody. I see the one of two things happening: it being toothless and being ignored, or again, seeing this getting onto the UN agenda, and NGOs will be pushing for more restrictions, and it will become something that it wasn't intended to do. And that's where, again, I think Second Amendment rights people in the United States get worried. You may say that a president doesn't regulate domestic markets, and that may or may not be true, but I could see easily how this opens the door to do that in the future.
Martin Butcher, from Oxfam, from your organisation's point of view, it could be toothless and it could be ignored, couldn't it?
That's a risk, and that's why Oxfam and the Control Arms campaign, of which it is part, hundreds of NGOs from all around the world, are committed to working with governments on the implementation of this treaty in the long term, at an international level, at a national level, regional and local levels as well. It's going to take a lot of hard work to make this treaty work, and that's what we're going to be doing from now on.
And Kay Stearman from the Campaign Against Arms Trade, there is a view that this is a long-term vision. This is a treaty that will be adapted and adopted by dozens of countries. It's been agreed to. It will be ratified by dozens of countries. It has to work, and ultimately it will if there is the political will among the countries themselves.
Well, what we also need is a parallel movement among the people of the big arms exporters. We've got to be saying to our governments, stop promoting arms, stop subsidising arms, stop supporting the arms industry, get people moving out of arms exports. You need that push. This is what we're doing here in the UK, and we'd like to see it done amongst the people in the other big arms exporters. They've got to take a lead.
But in lieu of that, would there be a point when you would be satisfied with some aspect of this treaty? I mean, is there any of that aspect of this treaty that would satisfy your group?
It's a very new treaty. We're still studying it, but I think we're pretty sceptical.
Sadly, we've run out of time. I'd just like to finish by thanking my guests. Kay Stearman, who's a spokesperson for the Campaign Against Arms Trade, Carly Florentine, a freelance journalist on the line, Charlie Wolf, American writer and broadcaster, and Martin Butcher, policy advisor for Oxfam. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.